123 years ago to this day, a man of 48 years lay dying in a small tin hut on the East African coast. The man is, as you have guessed by now, I'm sure, Cecil Rhodes, as not only is the title of the video about him and the thumbnail, but also he's peering down on me from up there. He was surrounded by his closest friends and one of his relatives, his brother Frank, who was a British Army officer, and he was lapsing in and out of consciousness. He'd been borne down by his lifelong illnesses for quite some time now. In fact, his illnesses were the reason he moved to Africa in the first place. Well, one of the reasons. Eventually, he succumbed to his illnesses, which included disfigurements of the heart, and which involved a sac the size of a child's head, according to the doctor's report, the autopsy that is, filled with fluid and prevented the oxygen from getting around his body. He had silver tubes to drain fluid from his legs. There had been plans arranged for him to go back to England. He had a ticket booked on the Saxon, a steamer ship, but this never came to be because his condition deteriorated so much before. Among the people with him was his closest friend, longest serving friend, definitely, I'm not sure about closest actually, Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, who was invited out after he demised to speak to the press, and the press asked what his final words were, as well they might have. Mr. Jameson replied, "So little done, so much to do." Asked later if these were his real final words, Jameson said, "Of course not. Do you think he was a poet?" It's much more likely that his final words would have been something more akin to, "God bless you all, and Jack, turn me over now." He was talking to Jack Grimmer, asking him to turn him over in bed, and this was the last thing ever heard out of perhaps one of the great Victorian men. Now, don't get me wrong, I say great here in the sense of important, not in the sense of good. There's a case to be made for both sides on Cecil Rhodes. He's one of the most divisive figures in history, certainly. And I can see the arguments on both sides. I'll get more into that later, actually. Let's carry on with the chronology first. He dies in his tin hut, and almost just as soon as he has, telegrams flood in from everywhere, commiserating his death. One is sent by the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, to Edward VII, commiserating him on the loss of so loyal and dedicated a servant. This is possibly up for some debate as well later, which we will see. The funeral proceedings for Cecil Rhodes are quite possibly the biggest I've ever heard of, more grand than even the ones for Marshal Stalin. And they were famously quite big, perhaps even bigger than some of our kings and queens here in England. Entire cities were draped in black and purple, which I guess are funerary colours. I didn't know purple was a funerary colour, but I suppose it is. Anyway, that's why I'm wearing what I'm wearing. And his body was taken by train, viewed by hundreds of thousands of people the whole way, up through South Africa, through the Boer republics, which he had instigated a war against, through the country that bore, it's been renamed now, that bore his name, the only country to ever be named after an Englishman, Rhodesia. It's called Zimbabwe and Zambia now. Up to the Matapos Hills, a place where Rhodes often went for contemplatory purposes. He went up there to think. He often described it as the seat of the world, or the view of the world, because it commanded an incredible view. I've never been there, but I imagine it must have been true. Another thing, he said that it was a massive location, and he was impressed by this massiveness. As dictated in, I think, his fourth will, he wrote several wills because of his ill health, which he suffered for all his life, so he was constantly worried about death. Again, more on that later. He dictated in his will that he should be buried beneath a simple brass plaque that was inscribed with the words, "Here lie the remains of Cecil John Rhodes." At his burial, he received the only ever King's Salute of the Matabele people, before or since. And in that alone lies an idea of the contradictions of this man. This video is not supposed to be a biography. Any biography of Cecil Rhodes it's a daunting task if you want to write a biography of him, because the man he cannot be encapsulated in a sentence or even a page summary. There's no way to accurately describe the enormity of his achievements, and I say that in both the traditional sense and the more modern sense. There are two definitions of the word enormity. The first of these being the modern one that's been given to it basically means enormousness, which is possibly the word I should have used. The second one means colossal wrongdoing, It's comes from a norm against the norms. I've got a few books that mention Rhodes. One of them is a historical encyclopedia, which grants him more or less half a page. One of them is a kind of children's history book, but it's I would say older children, so it's not, you know, simplistic. It's not kiddie. That grants him a paragraph. Both of these I found to be thoroughly underwhelming, considering that I've read a whole book on him. Not to try and brag too heavily, but this is the book I've read, by the way, by Anthony Thomas. I thought it was very good. If I'll write it in the description. I would think it's a jolly good source on him. I will warn you, though, if you like books to have pictures, it only has 2 pictures. I may as well show you them. Africa before Rhodes arrived, Africa after Rhodes died. That'll give you some idea of the man anyway. What I'm doing this video for is to talk about Rhodes, because he's very interesting to me. He's one of my... I hesitate to use the word hero, because he is definitely a man who has done some very, very terrible things. I suppose you could call him an anti-hero, in a way. It's strange, and I can understand. I absolutely wholeheartedly sympathise with some people for ethnic or cultural, political reasons, whatever, absolutely despise the man. And I understand you. I absolutely sympathise with you for having... Sympathise possibly isn't the right word, but I would not necessarily say you are wrong for that opinion. Because he really is possibly the most divisive man I know of in history. Because there are evil people. There are very evil people like Hitler and Chairman Mao, right? And then there are very, very good people. I'm not going to name any examples of very, very good people, but, you know, you can imagine the Mother Teresa, whomever you like. And Cecil Rhodes was a massive personality, a massive, one of the great, in the sense of big and important, one of the great men of Victorian times, possibly the greatest man in history. Again, remember that word meaning important. And it is that's why he's so divisive, I imagine. Now, what this video is meant to be is supposed to be an introduction, because the thing about Cecil Rhodes is, and I don't mean to be condescending in this way, but if you asked most people, what do you think of Cecil Rhodes? The response you'll get is, who? And that's fair enough, I suppose. You know, history is no longer as important to people as I imagine it used to be, although, you know, I could be wrong there, but I've been to Beamish, I've asked about it, and a lot of what they taught in schools was imperial history, so this man would have been very important in the earlier half of the 20th century, that is the 1900s, because the first century starts with the naught. It's the first 100 years. So I want to get his name out there, because love him or hate him, or somewhere in the middle like I am, he is an important part of history, and because of that, we should not be able to forget him. Because let's not be unaware of the fact that to remember someone is not necessarily do them a service. We remember the Second World War, despite the fact it was a terrible, terrible thing. And what that does is it allows us to avoid repeating our mistakes. And this, I think, is one of the key reasons why history is so important, and why remembering history is so important. I seem to remember a lot of people at my school saying, well, what's the point in history? It's all gone. It's in the past. Why would you study that? It's pointless, isn't it? No. Because, as David Mitchell put... I've gone like that because his book's on the floor over there. I've not got enough room for all my books. As David Mitchell puts it in his book, Unruly, history is possibly the best way we have of understanding the world. If you walk into a room and there's a man squealing in the corner and there's a chair on fire, sure, you could look at it like a physicist and say, well, the chair is on fire because of the chemical reaction between the particles, and the screaming is obviously because of the vibration of particles, and therefore we're perceiving the screaming in our ears. You know, you could look at it from a philosophical way and say, well, he's obviously screaming because of this existential whatchamacallit and thingamajigs. I've not picked philosophy at A-level, so I hope no one notices. But I think if you actually want to understand why the chair is on fire and why the man is squealing, you have to go to history. You have to say, well, he set the chair on fire, but he wasn't expecting to set the chair on fire, and because of that, he went into the corner and started screaming for help. That's the most effective way, and if we use that metaphor extrapolated to the whole world, It's the most effective way of understanding how we got where we are. And in many cases, it tells us where we ought to go with our future. We can learn from the history. History is the greatest teacher in combination with failure. I've gone off on a tangent somewhat there. Yes, I want to get his name out there. I want him to be a household name, as it were, for good or for bad. Now, possibly, I should give you a word on my personal opinions of the man. Had I made this video perhaps a year ago, maybe even, 8 months ago, I would have made this something of a lesson in imperial propaganda. Because I'll admit, I was taken in by his personality. He's a very commanding personality. And another thing is, repeatedly in the book, Thomas refers to him as all things to all men. And I think that's a very succinct way of describing Rhodes, because he has an incredibly good mind for getting what he wants. And that's another thing, is how he was so able to work his will in the world, how he was able to get what he wanted and achieve so much, is because of his immense charisma. Max Weber, the sociologist, among other things, talks about types of authority. Now, I gather there's rather a lot more, but in GCSE sociology we did the 3 kinds, which is traditional, which is sort of like lords and things, rational legal, which is like parliament, and there's charismatic. And this man possessed charismatic authority in bags. People listened to him because they believed in his personality, they believed in his will. And that's kind of a repeating cycle in and of itself, is because people believe in his power, he can work his will, and because he can work his will, people believe in his power. It goes in circles. Gone off on another tangent there, haven't I? I want people to know about him, because if we ignore everything else, he was interesting. He's a very, very interesting chap. He lived in a very, very interesting time, at least to me anyway. Now, that was it. I was talking about, right, had I made this a year ago, it would have just been Cecil Rhodes, very, very great guy. But that's another thing about him, is when you read about him, you find out that he was, partly because he was all things to all men, he was a man of incredible contradictions. One year he might be advocating for a kind of return to slavery. Nothing actually in the sense of buying and selling of humans, but a kind of neo-slavery whereby native Africans are segregated into, I suppose you might call them labour camps. He called them native reservations. And then the next year, he's negotiating face-to-face with the chiefs that his people are at war with. Without any weapons or security, he just waltzed into their camp. He had faith in them, that they would not hurt him. He went in with 3 other white men, and he managed to talk down the Mashona chiefs and end a war. So that's another thing about the man, is he is a man of extremes. And that's another thing why he's so polarizing, because while one group of people or one person might see that he did this terrible, terrible thing, another group of people might be focused on this amazing thing he did. And that, again, that's what I say, he's a very, very hotly debated figure. Now, I think I've dealt with that. Let's move on to the man himself. Who is Cecil Rhodes? Cecil Rhodes was the son of a preacher in Bishop Stortford, England, which is in Lincolnshire. He was born on the 5th of July, 1853. There is nothing terribly remarkable about his childhood that can be said, I don't think. I'm sorry, I should probably mention this. I've got a bit of a beastly cold at the time of recording, which is damned unfortunate. But, I mean, he had to put up with, heart attacks. So I think I can get through this. I mean, if he can colonise an area the size of Europe and plant the British flag on it, then I can sure as hell make a half-hour-long video with a cold. Where was I? Yes, I think with a lot of important people, we looked at their childhood to give us an an inkling of why they might have turned out the way they did. I don't think with Cecil Rhodes that's going to get you very far. He got on enormously well with his parents and with his brothers and sisters, and because he had quite a lot of them, I think. Though none of them are terribly important. Only two of his siblings really matter in the grand scheme of things. The rest of them don't come up in the narrative an awful lot. There is next to no memorial in his place of birth. I think there's a small plaque on the wall of the bedroom in which he was born, but other than that, nothing. I think the house in which he was born, the downstairs, has been turned into a hair salon. Though if that's up to date at time of filming, I'm not so sure. It wasn't long before he moved to South Africa, partly because of his health, as I said. He was dogged with ill health his entire life, and it was thought, the doctors presumed, that if he went to South Africa, the air would be drier and he wouldn't suffer so many heart attacks, and therefore he would live longer. So this was the natural choice. However, he did return to England quite a lot in his younger years to go to Oxford. He attended, I think, Oriel College. I'll put the words on screen if I was wrong. Yes, and what he would do is he would go to Oxford and study there, and then during the break he would travel down to South Africa, which sounds an awful hoo-ha, but you know, it was worth it for this guy. And while he was in South Africa, what he did was he met up with his brother Herbert. Now Herbert is a chap who was described as having every kind of sense but common sense, which is a description that's been levied on me. Not to try and draw any false parallels there though. And he had a mining claim in the New Rush mine. Now, the New Rush mine was one of 4 major diamond mines in South Africa, because the diamond mining business had really been getting off to a hell of a start down there. And Cecil was going to go and meet up with his brother, Herbert, sorry. I think there's Herbert and Frank, there's his 2 brothers. Frank was the one who was with him when he died. I might need to get some water in a minute, but we'll see. Anyway, he travelled through Africa and he made it to the New Rush mine. New Rush was later renamed Kimberley after the Colonial Secretary, Lord Kimberley. So I'm just going to go with the Kimberley mine from now on. Now, the thing with Herbert is Herbert didn't necessarily realise what a market there could be in diamonds. Now, Cecil realised this, and we'll get onto this a bit later, but Herbert was convinced that gold was the way to go, and so he left the diamond mining stuff to Cecil, and he went off into Bechuanaland, neighbouring Bechuanaland, to try and get the gold mines, and he blew himself up when he was trying to make moonshine gin. Some sparks flew out of his pipe and blew him up. And so this left Cecil with complete control over Herbert's claims in the Kimberley mine. Now, Cecil realised that a diamond in itself is completely useless. I mean, you can't eat it, you can't wear it, you can't do anything with a diamond. So he thought that diamonds are eventually just, if there is no control of supply, because there's all these different claims, and that's another thing, in the Kimberley mine there were rules on how many claims you could own. So the whole mine is this big pit, right? It's on an old volcano shaft, and it's subdivided up into lots of little square claims, they're called, which is basically a little plot of land. Now, an individual person, I think, could only own 3 claims at the start. That was the maximum. And Cecil saw that this is going to be damaging in the long run for the price of diamonds, because if there's all these little claims, and not to mention the illicit diamond buying market, which was unfairly levied by lots of the Boers on black people, diamond prices are going to plummet because of supply and demand. There's too many diamonds, anyone can get one, so they're not worth anything. And so he foresaw that the best thing to do would be to consolidate all the diamond mining under one company, and that this company could then control supply and the price of diamonds would increase. And he was right. After not too long, he joined up with a man called Rudd, and he essentially weaseled his way up. Again, this is not meant to be a biography, so I'm going to skip over a lot of the detail here. I do hope you'll forgive me. Sorry. Weaseled his way up through the Kimberley mine and then eventually ended up controlling the whole thing. And he did the same for the 4 other mines by buying out a man called Barney Banato, who was the other main diamond mining magnate in South Africa at the time. He was formerly a music hall act, which is where he got his surname from. And then after he'd secured his profit in diamonds, what he decided to do was turn his attention onto colonialism. And this is because, in large part, I'm sorry, this is what I had when I did my last videos, is I filmed these after dinner, so I've got burps in the system. Not very dignified, I know, but I'm sorry, there's not much I can do about biology. Part of the reason he decided to focus on colonialism is because of his ill health. Again, this is a running trend through his life. If we had to study the life of Cecil Rhodes for English literature, then one of the themes that you could do is illness. Like in Macbeth, my deepest apologies, like in Macbeth, there's a theme of, magic and nonsense. Anyway, because of his ill health, he was always constantly reminded that he was mortal. He was going to die, and he was going to die sooner than he could bargain for. And so he was constantly drawing up new wills, and in one of his wills, he wrote something that's come to be known as his Confession of Faith, where he essentially said, and I am paraphrasing this, "What is life without an aim? You need a goal in life, otherwise your life is meaningless." And I've considered that if God exists or not, and I guess there's a 50-50 chance he exists, which is a pretty wise. I'll agree with him on that one. So let's give him the benefit of the doubt. What does God really want in this world? Well, I guess he probably would want it well run. Now, I've looked at the people of the world, which I suppose he had to some degree, and I've decided that, remember I'm quoting him, or paraphrasing him here, so this is not me, and I've decided that English people are actually the best and the coolest people ever to exist, ever, and so I think it would be God's purpose if what I do with my life, my purpose to make my life meaningful, is I just try and make as much of the world as English as possible. And it was because of this that he decided, right, well, now I've made my money in diamonds, there's no point just having money, and that's another thing with Rhodes. He never saw money as the end, he saw it as the means to the end. He thought, right, now I've got all this money, what am I going to do? I think I'm probably going to carve out large chunks of the interior of Africa, and I'm going to stick the British flag on it, and that will be my purpose in life. That will be my goal, that will be my aim, that will be the meaning behind my existence. Thing is, because of his ill health, he had a major focus on speed. He thought, I've got to be quick. I've got to do this before I have that last heart attack and actually conk it, because otherwise I don't think there's anybody going to be here that's going to realise my ambition. Cecil Rhodes had this other idea that, to put it as Mr. Bridger puts it in The Italian Job, everybody in the world is bent. Now that doesn't mean gay, it means that they can be bought. Famously, when he was told that the Pope had raised an objection to his doings in South Africa, he said, how much money does the Pope want? He didn't believe in men's incorruptible will. He thought that they were all subject to outside forces and that they could be won over. And indeed, in his case, it did seem that nearly all men could be won over. Now, one problem with his ambition was that the British government didn't actually want to colonise the interior of Africa. And this is not just because of William Ewart Gladstone not liking colonialism. This is also because it was widely estimated that the interior of Africa, and South Africa at first, was just completely worthless of a colony. There's nothing there for us to colonise, they reasoned. Why on earth should we spend our taxpayer money, dagnammit, on this upstart colony that's got nothing to give us back? Whereas Cecil Rhodes saw the true potential of South Africa and the African interior. And so what he essentially had to do was he had to drag the British Empire, the British government, kicking and screaming into Africa in order to get them to do colonialism, which is interesting because that's basically the opposite of what we think happened with colonialism. Our general perception, right, is that Britain went to the Berlin Conference 1880 something. I'm rubbish with dates. And said, right, okay, that bit's ours, thank you very much, and just went off and stuck a load of flags in Africa. But here we have the British government actively saying, no, we don't want to colonise it. And Cecil Rhodes grabbing him by the ear, no, you're going to colonise it, all right, come here. So that's an interesting thing, and that's another big part of his character, is that somehow this upstart diamond miner. He's not even got a knighthood or any letters after his name like all the big important politicians do. And yet he's managing to force the British government, the most powerful government on earth at this point, into doing something it doesn't want to do. I think that's just as good a demonstration as I'm going to be able to provide you with of how important this man was in Victorian times. Anyway, so with the obstacle of the British government more or less overcome by him basically getting, just forcing them, what he did was he got together a team of his best chums and he said, right, you lot, there's this beastly sort of African chief up in the north. He's called Lobengula, Peter Lobengula, I think his first name was, though I imagine that Europeans probably gave him that one and it wasn't his own first name, Peter. And he said, right, you lot, you go to Lobengula's capital. It was called Gubbalawaya, spelled, I'll put it on the screen now. And you're going to go up there and you're going to tell him, look here, the De Beers Mining Company, that was what his company was called, after the mine, which was named after the Dutch bloke who lived there, Mr. De Beers. And you're going to tell this Lobengula chap that basically our company wants to be able to mine in his country. Nothing more, that'll come afterwards, which is a foreshadowing there. Yes, so he sent them up there and they managed, after some considerable diplomatic difficulty, to get Mr. Lobengula to accede to their wishes, basically. Now, Lobengula was by no means a savage. I want to be perfectly clear about this. He wasn't a savage and he wasn't stupid either. He was very, very clever about his businesses. The only trouble was anything that Rhodes could provide to the British government to say he had the right to go into their country had to be written down in English, because that's how the Europeans did business. They did it on paper with contracts, damn it. Whereas Mr. Lobengula and his kingdom couldn't read English, which I don't suppose he ought to have been able to, really, considering he didn't even know where England was necessarily. He knew it existed. He wasn't stupid, as I say. But there were lots and lots of he called them his white dogs. He said, you're driving me to insanity, he used to say. So there was lots and lots of different people, Boers and Englishmen, who were all trying to get the mining rights in his kingdom. And he was being very cautious about them, because they all claimed to be coming with the wishes of the Great White Queen. Now, I'm guessing that you'll know this is Queen Victoria. And he said, how do I know which of you lot actually has Queen Victoria's wishes in mind? How do I know which of you is the real representative of the Great White Queen? Now, Rhodes manages to get around this. I'll be totally honest with you, and this is really bad of me. I've forgotten how he gets around it. No, I tell you, I don't. I remembered it. This is it. So, Lobengula sends two of his blokes, two of his indabas, they're called, which is the Matabele word for ministers. He sends two of his indabas to go to London to meet the Great White Queen and ask her who is actually, being sent by her to confer with him in South Africa. So off they pop, and they get to London and they see the Great White Queen, and they're obviously enormously impressed because they've heard so much about her, and frankly, she's ace, and she's got a massive kingdom, a lot bigger than Lobengula's, so really they ought to be impressed. Although, to be fair, Lobengula doesn't have machine guns. And they carry the wishes of, King Lobengula, and they say, look, who's really acting on the interest? Because there's this white chap, the Great White Chief in South Africa called Ulodzi. That's what they called him, because they didn't have R in their phonemes. That was really crap. Phonemes. They didn't have R. So Ulodzi was the way of saying it in their language. And he says that he's been given the right by you to ask us for all of the mining rights in our country. And the Queen said, well, absolutely not. I never tell him that, or something akin to that. And they thought, aha, right, okay. So what they did was they got this in a letter from the Queen, and oh, that was it. So never mind, I'll tell you that in a minute. So they get this letter, right? But the thing is, I think Rhodes may have done some skullduggery, yes, because he realised that the Queen wasn't actually going to back him up. And so he got them on a steamship, right? But it was a very slow steamship, and I'll tell you why it was a very slow steamship. It was going a not exactly direct route to the Cape, considering first stop was Buenos Aires. So they went on the long route, and in the meantime, Cecil Rhodes used all of his political conniving, and he managed to use his position, my deepest apologies, in the Cape Parliament, that is the Parliament of Cape Colony, to which he was elected a member for Berkeley West, which was a Boer constituency, and that's another thing, he had to appeal to the white Boers, who were very, very anti-native Africans. That's another reason for a lot of his anti-native policies, is because he had to appeal to Boers. And he manages to use that and, show him all the coat of arms and the nonsense, the tomfoolery, show that to Lobengula and say, look, I really am the Great White Queen's best mate, yeah? Of course, he never went there in person. He always sent his lackeys. And eventually, they managed to coax Lobengula into signing the document that Rhodes had set up. Now, I do want to warn you, my chronology might be very, very floppy here. See, I can more or less remember the story, but I really am sorry. In terms of the exact chronology, the dates and all that, I am fuzzy. So I really hope you can forgive me. But again, this is not meant to be a biography. This is meant to be an introduction and a basic overview of the man to wet your whistle for him as a character, and for you to trigger your interest in the man, to get you to ask questions. Well, why did he do this? Why was he like this? And to get you to read about him. And I'll put loads of sources in the description of this video, the ones I've used, so you can see about him. Anyway, I got off track. So he manages to get Lobengula's signature on his treaty, and because of that, he sends in all of his chaps. They're called the Pioneer Column. I think they were fairly well revered in Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, but back the chronology is going to be very difficult here if I try and explain that, so don't worry about it. The Pioneer Column, and they go in and they build some cities. Now, one of them's Fort Victoria, which is not necessarily a city, but it's a settlement, is what I meant to say, settlement, because they're all going to start off as settlements. They become cities later on. And they also set up Salisbury, which is named after the Prime Minister, Robert Arthur Talbot Gascoigne Cecil. I think I got his name right. Marquess of Salisbury, 3rd Marquess of Salisbury. Knight Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order, lots and lots of other letters. I'll stick him here. Yes, and he's the reason we have the expression Bob your uncle, because his nephew, Arthur Balfour, became Prime Minister because of him, because he became Prime Minister because Bob was his uncle. Anyway, another interesting figure. Maybe I'll talk about him in the future. Yes, so they named the main settlement Salisbury. This later became the city of Salisbury, which was capital of southern Rhodesia, and it's now called Harare, which is the capital of modern Zimbabwe. Anyway, so the pioneers go in there, and then Lobengula thinks to himself, now hang on a second. I'm not so sure about this deal, I think that these white men have taken some jolly liberties out of me, and I'm not much pleased with what they're doing. So I think I'm probably going to start a war. And so there was a war. There was a war with the Matabele, which is the tribe of people that Lobengula was king of. And Rhodes's chaps win it, of course, because they've got the Maxim gun. This is the thing. There's a song by John Edmund about the Battle of Bembezi. The bravest of the brave could never match the Maxim gun, is one of the lyrics, which perfectly encapsulates what happens. Yes, and so it's called Rhodesia now. So Cecil Rhodes waltzes into Africa, and he renames the place Rhodesia. Now, he does eventually visit Rhodesia, and he's not terribly pleased with it, because, to be fair, they didn't send in people who know how to make houses and people who are doctors and people who are things like this. Although, to be fair, the man in charge, Dr. Jameson, was the best doctor in South Africa when Rhodes arrived. I am sorry. So a lot of the settlements are in a pretty dire state. And another thing is that Rhodes was hoping to find the lost city of Ophir, So you see, he'd sent expeditions up into Lobengula's country a lot long before he'd started the negotiations with him, and had found the remnants of Great Zimbabwe, which was the ancient capital of the people who used to live in that sort of area. And he seemed to think that these were obviously the remnants of the lost kingdom of Ophir, which is where King Solomon's mines were in the Bible. Now, I don't know a lot about King Solomon, but apparently King Solomon's mines were full of gold. And Rhodes has got a lot of experience in mining, don't you know? And gold is worth a damn lot of money. And if there's 4 diamond mines and lots of gold mines in South Africa, right? Just think how many more there could be up in, Matabele land. So, that was another reason why he sent his chaps up there in the first place, is because he thought there was lots of stuff to be pilfered. And that's why mining rights was such a key focus earlier. Yeah, anyway, so he goes and visits it, and he's not terribly impressed, but what-ho, we can't go back now. Now, the trouble is, they negotiated with Mr. Lobengula, but the problem there was that Lobengula was not the undisputed ruler of the area that he claimed to be. You see, there was 2 main ethnic groups in that area. There's the Matabele, of whom Lobengula was king, and there was the Mashona people. Now, the Mashona people were subjugated by the Matabele, and they didn't recognise Lobengula as their king. So, just because Rhodes had beat the Matabele in a war didn't mean the Mashona were just going to kick off their shoes and sit back with it. No, they were going to have a war as well, damn them. So, that was the second war. But there were bigger things at play, right? Because of the Boers. Now, the Boers, famous for the Boer War later on, were the Dutch farmers who were left in Cape Colony and had migrated upwards as part of the Great Trek. They were called the Voortrekkers, because they weren't too keen on the British not allowing slavery. Those upstart Brits, what do they even know about business? And they thought slavery's a jolly good thing and we're going to keep it. So we're going to just carry on going north until we get out of where the British live, and then we can keep our slaves. Isn't that good? That was one part of it. I'm sure there were other reasons. Anyway, so they established 2 main places. There was the Transvaal Republic and the Orange River Free State. These were called the Boer Republics. There were a few other Boer Republics. There was a Republic of Natalia, which was later taken over by the British, renamed to Natal, which is where the Anglo-Zulu War happened. There was Stellaland, which was incorporated, divided up into 2 constituencies, one of which was Berkeley West, which, as you'll remember, was Cecil Rhodes's constituency. Yes, sorry, I do hate the long pauses, but sometimes I need time to think. Yes, now the thing with the Boers was Cecil Rhodes wasn't awfully keen on them having their separatist ideas, because another thing is he wanted a unified South African republic. Not republic, sorry, I shouldn't say republic, the Boer republics, that's where I got it from. He wanted a dominion of South Africa, basically. Like there's a dominion in Canada, where formerly there were lots of... I'm rushing, sorry. Whereas formerly there were lots of little Canadian provinces like Alberta and Quebec, and New Brunswick, that's another one of them. And Australia, where there was formerly Queensland and Western Australia, and what's the other one? What's another interesting one? Victoria, Van Diemen's Land, later renamed to Tasmania, after Abel Tasman, the Dutchman. So that brings us full circle. He wanted a unified dominion of South Africa, like these other places. And this is also because of another of his imperial ambitions. He wanted Cape to Cairo railway and telegraph line, which is essentially, if you imagine Cape Town down the bottom of Africa here, Cairo up the top of Africa here, he wanted to link them all the way through the middle on British territory. And he very nearly got there, because expansion through Egypt into the Sudan, and then Kenya, British East Africa. I'm terrible with East and West. I'm really not that good, am I? And then he got Cape Colony, and then he got up through the Boer Republics, up through Southern Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia, Nyasaland. The only thing that stood in his way was German East Africa, which is now called, goodness grief, can I remember? Goodness grief. Tanganyika, or Tanzania, that's what it's called now. And I believe they were a participant in the world's shortest war, 8 minutes against the British government. Anyway, I really got off track there. So he wanted this Cape to Cairo railway, so he wanted a united dominion of South Africa, which was realised shortly after his death. sorry to spoil it, but there are no spoilers in history, really, so I can't really, what do you want me to do? Yeah, the Titanic, it sinks at the end. I've not ruined the film for you, have I? Now, the Boers were awfully keen on separatism. They thought the British government do not represent our interests. But, you see, Cecil Rhodes had a cunning plan, because there were gold mines in the Transvaal, right? And as previously happened in Kimberley, there were lots and lots of people who went to these gold mines to try and make their fortune. Now, some of these were Boers who lived in the Transvaal, and some of these were, as they called them, Uitlanders. Outlanders, I'm going to say, to make it more convenient for me being British. Foreigners, basically, who also wanted to get a piece of the gold action in the Transvaal. Now, the trouble was, the Transvaal wasn't awfully keen on these Outlanders, and so they levied loads of taxes on their profits. And this meant that basically they couldn't earn as much from their mining. Now, as I say, Cecil had a cunning plan, and he put together the idea that what we're going to do is when these people go on strike, right, we're going to get it so that they have sent a telegram to us asking for help, right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to send my soldiers into the Transvaal and take the whole place over. An awfully cunning scheme. It didn't end awfully well. Because, well, it started a bit terribly as well, because in order to get into the Transvaal, he couldn't go from the Cape Colony because he was Prime Minister there. Oh, by the way, he got elected Prime Minister of the Cape. Probably should have told you that. So he couldn't send his soldiers up because that would be unparliamentary, damn you right. So what he had to do was he had to get them in from Bechuanaland. But the thing is, Bechuanaland was a separate British colony, so he had the opposite problem. His soldiers would have no right to be in there in the first place. So what he conspired to do was he went to the governor of Cape Colony, Sir Hercules Robinson, who was one of the chaps who he had in his pocket. He had a lot of chaps in his pocket. He must have had a big top pocket. And he basically got him to sell him a bit of Bechuanaland, because he said, oh, well, I'm building my railway, don't you know? Oh, my railway, very, very important stuff, my railway. And yes, so eventually, after some diplomatic capabilities, whatnot, he managed to buy himself a little bit of land for the railway. So now there's no problem with me having my soldiers in there, because, oh, well, they're obviously just to defend the construction from all those bloody Africans, don't you know? Yes, so there was his alibi. He's got his soldiers there. Now, the second problem was that the Outlanders weren't altogether sure they actually wanted to go on strike and start a war. They thought it would be a jolly good idea if maybe Rhodes didn't start a war, because that would probably be more damaging to the mining interests. But nevertheless, they managed to get a telegram to Dr. Jamison. Dr. Jamison, previously mentioned, he was one of Rhodes's bestest friends ever. He was friends with a lot of doctors, primarily because of his poor health, and since there was only about 4 good doctors in all of the Cape Colony at the start of things. So he was well acquainted with lots of doctors. Jamison was possibly his most loyal servant, and he was a company official in the De Beers Mining Consortium. So, really, I'm sorry, my throat's terribly dry. Tell you what, should we take an intermission? I'll go get a glass of water. I don't normally do breaks in these, but it will improve the quality of the video. I will be back imminently. There we are, water. Oh, sweet relief. That might have wobbled the camera a bit. Anyway, so Jamison was one of the directors of the De Beers Mining Company, so he was involved with the proceedings quite a lot. And because of this, he was part of the scheme that was about to unfold, and it is his right to call it a scheme. He got a telegram from the leader of the Outlanders Union or something or other, saying, we would like your help, please. That would be awfully jolly good if you could come along and help us urgently. This sort of thing. The thing is, the wording was very ambiguous, and there was a place where there ought to have been a comma, but because you don't have punctuation in a telegram, other than stop, they didn't know where the comma should be, and so that sort of led to a bit of confusion. It's documented in that book, Goins Grammar. No, it's not. Sorry, it's not Goins Grammar. It's I read them one after the other. It's in Eats, Shoes and Leaves. There's a good book about punctuation. It talks about the Jamison raid thingamajig with the comma. Anyway, so he got this telegram, and he made sure they left a date off of it, so he'd write the date on when it was relevant. So it was obviously seemed like it was urgent, and That gave them all the proof they needed, but then there was a bit of trouble about whether the Outlanders were actually going to go on strike or not. And there was a lot of urgent telegrams between Cecil Rhodes and Jamison and the Colonial Secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, who's a very interesting figure in his own right. He's probably going to get his own video at one point or another. Who was one of the pucker imperialists. I believe in a British Empire. I do not believe in a little England, was something he famously said at his Birmingham speech. Learn to think imperially is another one. Famous later for his idea about tariff reform, where you basically say the British Empire will not accept trade from anywhere else, and we're going to charge you through the nose if you want to trade with us, because that's the best way to protect our trade interests. Anyway, I'm getting off track. So he was obviously a very easy chap to get into Cecil Rhodes' pocket, because he was, well, empire, you know. And so he was implicated in the scheme, although he managed to get himself off later on. I'll talk about that. Yes, anyway, so there was a lot of frantic telegramming saying, no, don't go, they're not going to do anything. And Jamison's like, well, yeah, but I kind of want to go. You know, I've got all the guys here now, you know, go and raid the place. And then he did. So he went off on what would later be called the Jamison raid, and he basically waltzed all the way through the country, and they were all the Boers were thinking, hang on a second, this guy's up to something. So they followed him all the way through, and then they basically clubbed up on him and stopped him. So that was ill-fated, because he didn't have the Outlanders going on the strike at the same time. He didn't have any support, so him and his cavalry column were basically just bonked. And this was a major setback for Rhodes, because it showed that he had violated the will of Her Majesty's government, and so he was possibly going to lose his royal charter. Now, I should mention, actually, that this was another way he managed to make himself look more presentable to Lobengula earlier, is because he had a royal charter company, the British South Africa Company. Like, there was the British East India Company, the British Niger Company, there was the British South Africa Company, which is a company that was set up by Rhodes and was given a royal charter, which is generally given to any big company that's going to do big imperial-based things. They're still given out today. There's one in my college, actually. I'll stick a photo up. I took one today. Yes, so there was the Royal Charter Company, which had a coat of arms and a flag and all sorts of nice, lovely-dovey things. But if he used he used that wrongly, because the government didn't want him to invade, and there's telegrams to prove it. So he was threatened that he might lose his royal charter, and he might lose his expansion through the north to get his Cape Cairo Railway. His entire life's work was at risk here. This was a major, major setback. But luckily, because he'd implicated a lot of important government officials, Sir Hercules Robinson, Joseph Chamberlain, in his scheme, he was able to pull the strings. See, the camera's shaking. I'm sorry about that. He was able to pull the strings and get himself out of it. So he basically said he was taken on trial back up in England, and it was possibly one of the funnier trials that probably ever happened, because he would just sit there very slowly reading off of his paper exactly what he wanted to tell them, exactly what he considered, exactly what his lawyers advised him to say, and everyone would sit there, and then the prosecution would occasionally say, oh, hang on a minute, what about this? And he would say, I didn't know that was going to be used in evidence. Can I have the rest of the day off? I'll go to lunch, think about it, and get back to you tomorrow. And then they'd say, yep, sounds fair to me. That doesn't sound suspicious at all. And so it was the most ridiculously rigged trial in history. Anyway, so he miraculously manages to pull that off, keep his royal charter. Phew, crisis averted. Oh, wait a second, hang on. The Mashona people are still at war with us. You see, there's a few things happening at the same time. It's difficult to construct a narrative around that, so we're going to have to ping-pong. Yeah, the Mashona War, which is still going on at this point in time. How are we going to sort that out? So Rhodes goes up to Mashonaland himself. He says, right, we're going to sort this situation out. And he has a change of heart, for instance. Well, one thing is that he's doing his cavalry charges with the rest of them, and he says that he's spurred on more by fear of looking afraid than fear of fear. One thing is that he was famously very, very afraid to get hurt. He didn't like the idea that his body would be mutilated, to use a very dramatic word. He was very afraid of pain, interestingly. But he was more afraid that people would think he was afraid, because he's an icon now. He's an empire builder. He's a hero of empire. hero of empire. So people are going to look up to him. He's going to be one of those people that, sorry, I've accidentally done that finger at you, that cannot be seen to be afraid. Just hit my front tooth of my glass. Anyway, and then there's one ceremony where they have to bury some of the British dead. And Rhodes seems to realise that this war is not a good thing. So the very next sort of bit of time, I was going to say the very next day, but as I said, I don't know the chronology of it, so there's probably about a week or a month, who knows, where he decides, you know, solve these military geezers, I've got a better idea. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to waltz my way into the Matabele camp, and I'm going to negotiate a peace. And so what he does is he writes a letter. No, he doesn't, because they can't read. He sends a messenger, definitely, that's what happens, saying, if you want to negotiate peace, stick up a white flag on that tree before this time or whatever, and if you don't want to negotiate peace, stick a red flag up. Signed Ulodzi. No, it wasn't a letter, it was a man. And so they send the bloke off, and he comes back, and then, well, the white flag goes up. Right, okay. But they say you're only allowed to take 3 white men. Fair enough, I'll only take my 3 white men. And they ride off into the Matapos Hills, which, as you might remember, is where he ends up buried. And then as he gets up there, one of the chaps says, look, don't get off your horse, because they might ambush us. And he says, right, get off your horse, everybody. Everyone get off your horse. And that is because he wants to make himself look trustworthy, which works, because they all think, oh, not on his horse. Probably doesn't mean there's any harm then. So they all gather round. There's a nice picture of that, which I'll put here. And he basically negotiates the peace. Granted, he does this by lying a lot. But he negotiates the peace. And so eventually the war ends. Lovely. This is not the only war that Cecil Rhodes will be involved in. Because the Second Boer War was soon to arrive. Now, the Second Boer War, don't actually remember how it started. I'm going to use the same excuse that this is not going to be a biography, and we're already more or less an hour long, which I didn't intend this to be. So I can waffle on about Cecil Rhodes. But yes, so he gets himself involved with the Second Boer War, gets himself in some siege or other. Mafeking? Might have been the siege of Mafeking. That's done. And then he gets relieved by a load of soldiers, including Robert Baden-Powell, and then he reaches death's door. So, that was more or less a very, very concise biography of Cecil Rhodes. So hopefully that's been enough to get you interested. Now, his legacy. That's the more contentious thing in today's society, because you can't change the facts, can't change the history. What do we have as a legacy of Cecil Rhodes? Well, one thing that he stipulated in his will is that there was going to be a scholarship that he was going to set up. And this was going to be for anyone from Britain, America, and Germany included later. And it was basically, the idea was that it was going to pay for people to go to Oxford, and that this would create more Rhodeses, I think was his idea. Because he himself went to Oxford and he learned from John Ruskin there. That's where he picked up a lot of the colonialism stuff. Which is probably where he ended up writing it in his Confession of Faith and thinking that it was his purpose to make the world English. So that's one legacy. So I dare say there's quite a lot of people who've been educated at the expense of the Cecil Rhodes estate. There's just a funny story I remembered actually. I probably should have said this somewhere near the start, but he gets a house built, Grutas Shore, and it was the residence of every Prime Minister of the Cape up until Nelson Mandela. And the gardeners asked him, how many yards do you want planted with rhododendrons? And he said, 5 miles. So that gives you a sense of the chap. Anyway, his legacy. So there's the Rhodes Scholarships, which send people to Oxford. And at Oxford, there's a statue of him. Or at least there was. I'm not sure if they've taken it down yet. I hope they haven't, because that's one thing I want to say, is that there are lots of people who are in a campaign called Rhodes Must Fall. And this is centered around taking down statues of Cecil Rhodes. Now, the thing with statues is nobody's perfect. I know what you're saying. Not perfect. You're very far off being not perfect if you're going to impose legislation that basically reintroduces slavery. Yeah, but what I'm saying is, everybody you might make a statue of has obviously got some bad things about them, and in some cases very bad things. You might not know this, but Admiral Nelson, who's commemorated on the great big column in Trafalgar Square, Trafalgar Square, gave speeches advocating for the transatlantic slave trade. And he also hanged a load of people. I think he hanged 100 people on some island near Italy for treason against some king or other, not the King of England. Anyone you're going to make a statue of is going to have some kind of questionable legacy, right? So you can't focus on the bad things with a statue. You have to focus on the good things. Why is that statue of Rhodes there? Why is it at Oxford? Because of his scholarships, because of his funding for Oxford, and because he's a well-known, or not so much a well-known, but a very important man who went to Oxford, right? That's why that statue's there, not because of his treatment of native Africans. So I'm sceptical of the claims that the statues should fall. Obviously, as I've stated, I'm in two minds about Rhodes, because the thing is, I've not necessarily replaced my view. There is still in one half of my brain, there's the view of him that I had when I first knew about him as a character, when I first learned about him, is of him as a dedicated servant of the crown, a hero of empire. And then on the other hand, there's the conniving businessman. Just give me 1 second. Low batteries come up on the phone. There we are, sorry. Minor crisis. Don't worry, I'll try and wrap this up because the phone might run out of battery. And on the other hand, there's the conniving businessman who defrauded his own government, went against the wishes of the Queen, Queen Victoria no less, to try and serve his own ends. So I can see why you might want to take down his statues, why some people might want to take down his statues, but I don't think the way to go forward in society is to tear down the statues of anyone who doesn't exactly embody our present moral values. Now, as I previously mentioned, he was the only man to ever have a country, only Englishman to ever have a country named after him. That is Rhodesia, or was Rhodesia. Now, Rhodesia had three constituent parts. Northern Rhodesia, which has been renamed to Zambia now. Nyasaland, which is, I think... No, it's called... Is it called Malawi? I think it might be called Malawi. I'm not sure, but it was called Nyasaland then because of Lake Nyasa. And then there's Southern Rhodesia. Now, Southern Rhodesia became a country in its own right. It was only around for 14 years. It declared independence on Armistice Day, 11th of November, No, I've got that wrong. But it was the 11th of November when they declared their independence, and they were around for 14 years up until the 1970s, I think, run by a chap called Ian Duncan Smith, who... I remember said, what we want is the best government, not necessarily a black government, not necessarily a white government. But I think he basically wanted a white government. So don't take his word for it. And there's a large group of people on the internet who seem to think Rhodesia was really, really ace. My friend Ben's one of them. Though I think they just like the pictures of the chaps in really, really short shorts. I don't know where I was going with that, but he got the country named after him. So that's another bit of his legacy that's gone now. I'll be honest, there's a lot of stuff that I've thought of now that I really wanted to say about him, but I've forgotten it. Like, for instance, there was the thing about Pickering, his good friend Pickering. And he was, if there was one group he really did hate, I doubt if he hated Africans, I doubt if he hated Boers, if there's one group he really hated, then it was women. He wouldn't have anything to do with women, he never got married, he never had children. When he was older, there was a Polish princess who tried to blackmail him into marrying her. So he took her to court and he won, presumably because all the lawyers thought he was a top geezer. When his friend Pickering fell off his horse and broke his leg, Dr. Jamison, his friend, told him, "I'm going to send you a nurse for that chap." And he said, "I don't want a woman nosing about. She doesn't know anything. I'll do the work. I'll bandage his leg up." So if there were any group of people he actually hated, I imagine it was women. Can't imagine why that was. There's a significant conspiracy theory that he was a homosexual. I don't believe it. I think he was a homosocial. Only socialised with men. The rumours about him hating women went back even to the contemporary time, because when he met Queen Victoria asked him, "Mr. Rhodes, are you a woman hater?" And he very tactfully, all things to all men, brackets women, replied, "How could I hate a sex to which your majesty so eminently belongs?" But yeah, so generally he didn't have any doings with women. Yes, and on that cheery note, I think that's all I have to say about Cecil Rhodes. I do hope you'll be interested by the chat, because he really is well worth looking into. He's probably the most interesting person that not many people have heard of, though that's a very convoluted accolade to give a person I recognise. As I say, the book I read on him is Rhodes, The Race for Africa, Anthony Thomas. The good thing about this book, though, is that you might see it says BBC up in that top corner there, and that is because at the same time as the book, or not at the same time, but the conjoined with the book is an 8-part documentary series on the life of Rhodes called The Life and Legend of Cecil Rhodes. And it's on YouTube, would you believe it? Hosanna in Excelsis. For free. So I'll link all 8 parts of it down in the description. Yeah, I really do encourage your further reading on this topic. And I do want to reiterate, right, at the end of this, I'm not saying that he was a good person. I'm not saying that he was a bad person. I'm just trying to tell you about him in a somewhat amusing way that makes you want to watch all the way through this hour and a bit long video. So thank you very much. I hope you found this interesting. And I do hope you'll look into him further. And I look forward to making more videos in the future. Anyway, thank you and good night.